Ruchem Aboim B'Shem Irgen Shir I'd like to welcome everyone to today's shir from Rabbi Yakov Smith Shlita on the Indian of Shmiras, Haloshon, B'Chayi, family life, and Shmiras Haloshon. To have the great disclosing sponsoring a shir, call Irgen Shir 718-851-8651 or email ist@yeshivanet.com. Rabbi Smith.
This is today's subject, Shmiras Haloshon and family life. This doesn't need any hakdama. We see today a magnificent people are learning and living Shmiras Haloshon. V'ozni shamati shaylas that people ask to show the sensitivity, the devotion to Shmiras Haloshon. It's a tremendous kiddush Hashem. You live in a world that character assassination is not only socially accepted, it's our constitutional right, and you're allowed to say what you want. Freedom of speech is the hallmark of the American people. And you have Yidden that are living Shomrei Lashon. It's mamish a tremendous cover Torah and Kvod Shemayim. But Lamaisa, people ask questions. I'm going to share with you a few of them today. A question where, unfortunately, it happens that a parent is talking lashonhora and the child is sitting there. How should he react? What should he do? Or a parent was told something in confidence that the married daughter told the mother a certain secret. Don't tell the father. And the mother feels she's helpless, she can't help the child, she wants to tell the husband. And a host of other questions, as we'll see today, regarding chinuch habonim, regarding shalom bayis, regarding kibbutz. And that, of course, makes this sugya very challenging, because mitzad echad we know the unusual importance of Shmiras Haloshon. The Shalmi calls kibbutz, Shmiras lashonhora, the kibbutz, the chamura sheba chamurais. But then again, shalom bayis is the importance of shalom bayis, yimach shmoi, to bring shalom bayis. Chinuch habonim is the issur of Yiddishkeit. So how is a person to juggle these various important factors? So I guess the crux of the issue is, we know there's a certain heta of lashonhora l'te'eles. Although something is asa, but l'te'eles, there's not only you're allowed to, but it's a mitzvah. To save a person from damage, the Chafetz Chaim develops that theme. Lashonhora l'te'eles is not only mutter, it's a mitzvah. It's part of the obligation of leisamer al dam riyecha. The question is, does that apply to every kibbutz situation? After all, I want to do it al kibbutz. Does it apply to every shalom bayis situation, to every chinuch habonim situation? Is there a special heta regarding these type of relationships in family, whether it's shalom bayis or chinuch habonim or kibbutz? So it seems very clear, and actually it is the first halacha l'maisa of the Sefer Chafetz Chaim. After the very frightening Hakdama, the 17 Lavim, the 14 Esten, the Arurin, and a little bit of Hakdama, but in Klal Aleph Halacha Hey, the Chafetz Chaim says emphatically, there's no chilik who is involved, even if Aviv or Imai, or Rabbi, who's mechuyev in the Kvaydam, Moira'am, so listed Devreihem, even in the relationship of a parent, which is the most important devotion that a person has to have, says the Chafetz Chaim, there's no heta to talk lashonhora. In Hilchas Rechilas Aleph Hey, he says it even more clearly. Even if the parent insists, I want you to tell me what happened, and it involves lashonhora, b'chol gavni asa. So obviously, there doesn't seem to be any special heta regarding close relatives. I care to even kibbutz, that there's a chiyav kibbutz, moira, la yista devorav. There's no special heta l'chayr. And at the emphasis, the Chafetz Chaim in Klal Yud, at the end of Sif Dalit, says, Rabbim make this mistake. They think there's an obligation, מבשרך תתעלם. And the Chafetz Chaim again says it very emphatically, there is no such heta. The Hilchas lashonhora applies to all people, relatives and non-relatives equally. But the truth is, there's more at stake regarding kibbutz. Because the pasuk in Parshas Kisavoy, Ore makla ava v'imoy, a very unusual klala to someone that Rashi teaches is mezalzel on his parents. And it's noteworthy when the Chafetz Chaim and Essay Yud mentioned this Ore makla ava v'imoy, he adds Hashem yishmerenu. I don't know if any place else the Chafetz Chaim writes that when he speaks about an issur. Obviously, being mezalzel on a parent is Hashem yishmerenu. So now the question is, Ma yasa ben v'lo yechta? The parents are either talking lashonhora or asking him to say something. Mitzad echad he can't comply. Mitzad sheni, should he say no? They're going to be hurt. They're going to be embarrassed. So obviously, step one is these type of concerns should never come up. You know, we talk about a dora of ach shadora. It's something taka that we could be very proud of, but there should be a zero tolerance for parents talking lashonhora. Now, Rab Chatzkel in this Mechtavim in Reish Tzadik Vav, he says the importance of chinuch habonim regarding Shmiras Haloshon, because if parents are living shomrei lashon, the children will be influenced. That's the greatest chinuch. And he quotes what the Alta says, that when the father is talking lashonhora and the child is there, it's like pouring hot lead down the child's throat. I don't like to be so graphic, but that's one of the Mises Bezdin, if you know what I'm talking about. And the Alta says when a parent talks lashonhora in the presence of a child, that's what he's doing to the child. So such a shaila shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be, especially in our dar. It should be a zero tolerance, but l'maisa it comes up, ma yasa ben v'lo yechta. But what makes it more challenging, the Chavetz Chaim, in the end of Perek Ches, Klal Ches, quotes a Tanid B'Eliyahu in the beginning of Perek Chaf Aleph, which is Eliyahu Navi told Rav Onan, one of the Amoraim, a child should not listen as his parents or parent talks lashonhora. If he's quiet, im asakain, hu v'heim einam amalam yameim u'shnaiseim. I'd rather not touch that, but not only it's an avil on the parent, it's an avil on the child to allow this to continue. Obviously, a child has to do something. The Chavetz Chaim also quotes the Gemara in Shabbos Nun Daled Amud Beis, Mishayesh le'limchais ba'anshe beisai. If someone was supposed to be moicha when his family is doing something wrong, ve'enai moicha nitfas, he's blamed for that avla. So obviously the son has to do something. But the question is, what should he do? Mitzarecha ora makla ava ve'imai. But what makes this much more challenging, which really highlights the importance of kibbud av va'em, the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Pei Vav says that if the parents did an avla and the chayiv Mises Bezdin, so the son should not be the one to administer Mises Bezdin, even though it's a mitzvah, but find other mitzvahs. And Gemara has a pasuk. Frag Rabbi Chanan in Kovetz Ha'ara Siman Yud Zayin, why taka can't the son do it? We know the famous Gemara in Yevamos Daf Vav Amud Aleph, that if the father tells a child, don't return the Aveda or be metamil ameisim, he can't listen. Ani Hashem, kolchem chayavim b'chvaydi. In other words, the kvayt shemayim overrides kibbud av. So Fred Rabbi Chanan, a very interesting question. We see b'makay mitzvah, there's no inyan of kibbud av. So why can't the son give the father Mises Bezdin, it's a mitzvah, and let him overlook kibbud av? Again, we should hope he finds better mitzvah to do. But in theory, why can he do it? So Rabbi Chanan says a davar noira ma'od. And he says, the emes is punkt fakert. When it comes to kibbud av, there's no way a person can say no to a parent. But the pasuk says, kabir avicha ani Hashem, or ish imay v'avu tiro ani Hashem. So there's exeres hakasiv, the Rebbeinu goes first. But without the exeres hakasiv, you have to listen to a parent unconditionally. Zok Rabbi Chanan, giving Mises Bezdin is included in Ora Makla Ava Ve'imai. And there's no Gzeres HaKasav Ani Hashem. So therefore, Kibbud Av overrides even Ratzon Hashem. You need a Gzeres HaKasav Ani Hashem. Pila Ploim. It reminds me what the Meshech Chochma understood from the same Gemara in Yevamos Davav. You know, Bacham are very quick to quote the Gemara. I don't listen to my parents. Tell me to be Ivan Aveira. The Meshech Chochma saw a different lesson. The father tells his son, who's a kohen, go into a basic forest. Or the father tells his son, don't return an Aveda. So the average one will say, my father's Meshuggah, I'm not listening to him. You know what the Gemara says? Yachal Yishmaloi. You have to listen. Narvas, what can we do? It's Exeres HaKasav Ani Hashem. The starting point is Yachal Yishmaloi. Now, I don't know if we paskin like this, Rabbi Chanan, but the Rabbi Chanan is saying a davar noira. When it comes to Ora Makla Ava Imai, being mavaza parent, there's no heter b'makam mitzvah even. So what does a child do? Parents talk to lashonhora, or they're requesting him to say something. What should he do? So avada, the first step, like in every time we have a situation like this, are you really certain that what your parents want you to do is an issur? Avada lashonhora is categorically asa, but maybe it's tayelas, maybe there's a potential tayelas. Don't forget, when it comes to all halach, especially not listening to a parent, lo yamar it's chassid. First, you have to determine, is there any heter or possible heter? If the parents imply that it's tayelas, avada, you could trust them. But we're talking about it's a blatant lashonhora that's really not sanctionable. So obviously, a child has to use a lot of seichel. He is being patish l'sadin. That's exactly where he finds himself. So the best approach would be try to change the subject in a nice way, or by Shabbos table, start to sing the zemer along Kol Mekadesh if need be. Now the truth is the parents will realize where he's coming from. But he did it in a darchei noim, he did it in a respectful way. What he's saying is, I would love to go talk to you, but I'm not allowed to. But I have to respect you. If something comes across genuinely respectful, parents appreciate that. Even though it's really in a subtle hint. Remember once, I'll never forget this, I heard in Hesped, someone said, a relative said about his relative that had passed away, that whenever we spoke lashonhora, he quickly sang Shmiras. Even though they were the perpetrators, but they respected it. Because at the end of the day, he did it respectfully. He tried to, rechem with their feelings. So a child that finds a way of doing it a nice way, or maybe should suddenly volunteer to go into the kitchen and help clean up, something that sends the message in a respectful way. That would satisfy the Tanit B'Eliyahu and the Gemara's request. Don't just stand by, do something. If it doesn't work, so then we have a Gemara, l'chayra. In Kedushin Lamed Beis, and again, Yeridei Reish Mem, Sifir Av Mechaba Paskin, like this. Ra'aviv she'av al divrei Torah, la'yayim alay avart al divrei Torah. Don't say, hey, you're doing something wrong, but say it in a roundabout way. He says, isn't there a shaila about something, about doing this? So what would this child do? He could say, I just learned this in our daily limud, that this might be lashonhora. Or, I was makabel to keep an hour of Shmiras Haloshon, which I'm in right now. Can we not talk about this now? I was makabel for Yerushalayim for someone. Again, try to use seichel and devotion to parents in finding an eitzah. But what I found to me very surprising, Rabbi Nissen Karel in the Sefer Chut Shani, in Hilchos Kibbutz Av, has an incredible diuk, which I learned to Gemara, we all learned to Gemara, I don't know if we picked up on it, but he says a tremendous chiddush based on a diuk. This is in Hilchos Kibbutz Av, Amud Reish Sad the Gimel. The Gemara's lashon is, and Chaba quotes the same lashon, Oiver al divrei Torah, al yoyma abba avart al divrei Torah. It sounds like the father's doing something wrong, so don't tell him you did it. Zogt Rav Nissen, when is there a chiyuv to do it carefully when it's a thing of the past? They did something wrong. Now it's a mitzvah of teichacha. Teichacha has to be done very gently, especially with parents. But let's say the father is doing an aveira. If there's a crime in progress, now it's not a question of teichacha. Now it's a question of la'afrisha mi'isura. Then even to be mevaza parent is acceptable. I looked again, that's what he says. The diak is interesting because the Gemara uses both lashonos as the Mechaba does. Mechaba is aval divrei Torah layayim avarta. So he's learning that the ik is avarta, a thing of the past. So the question is teichacha, then you're limited to something very gentle. But lafrisha mesura, if you can't do it in a gentle way, you must stop the aveira in progress. I guess that's based on the famous Gemara in Brachas that if you test them with beis, the makam sheish chil Hashem, ein cholkin kavod l'rav, ein chachma vein eitz vein tvuna neged Hashem. So according to that, if takid is an aveira, the son could use any method, even bezoyin. But I must say it's a big chiddush, because kibbut or makla of ve'imai is something of extreme importance. In a Sefer Moyer Hayim V'Kibudam, it's page Kufchav Gimel, he quotes Rabbi Tzion Abba Shaul, who was asked this question, didn't mention Rabbi Nissan's Psak, but if a parent is doing something wrong, is there a heter to mevazeh them? And he said no. As long as the parent is still an oisa ma'isa amcha, being mevazeh a parent is unthinkable. So now what do we do? So I saw Rab Chaim Kanievsky was asked mamash our question also. A parent is saying lashonhora, what should the child do? So he says, b'derech klal, they won't be makabel what you say, it won't work. So you're just left with causing magbas nefesh and shav al tasa adif. Someone asked him, but it says by a deraisa, you mechayiv to mechiach, even if it doesn't help. So he says that's if it will leave some type of roishim. But here, you're just causing your parents agmas nefesh, just stay out of it. Well, no, this is what our G'dalim are saying. In other words, it's not that they're minimizing the issur of lashonhora, but they're emphasizing what kibbut av is all about, what it means, hukshu k'void m'kvoid ha'makom, what it means, the concept of chamura shebechamurais. So a child, a son, a daughter has to know, you have to go with extreme caution. Just to ignore it, we have a ton of the Belio and Gemara and Shabbos, you can't ignore it. Try to use a nice way, a roundabout way, a respectful way. But again, if it's not going to help, if the parents are so adamant about what they want to say, then unfortunately there's nothing to do. Now of course this is painful to even think about a scenario like this. Why should parents not join the revolution that we see instead of hindering it? Why are they hindering this feeling? Children are taught in yeshiva the importance of Shmiras Haloshon. They come home and their parents are talking lashonhora. So that's the ideal, that parents should join the revolution, this achshadara. But if it comes to it, a person has to be very careful with kibbut av and of course with Shmiras Haloshon. What I wondered about is what Chavetz Chaim says, which is really, part of it is a Gemara. In Klal Vav Sif Hey, Chavetz Chaim says if you're sitting with a chabura of people talking lashonhora, you should walk away, I guess get up in a protest and walk away, or minimally, he says, do like the Gemara says in Ksubas Dafei, put your fingers in your ears, or your earlobes in your ears. If you notice it fits, suck the Gemara, because that's what you're supposed to do when you hear lashonhora, or any type of diba asura. The Gemara is saying two things, either the Chavetz Chaim is saying two things, walk away, or close your ears. So I once mentioned this in the yeshiva, and someone says, yeah, but you're embarrassing the one that's talking. It wasn't talking about a parent's time, by a chassan, all of a sudden you walk away. And he was referring to the Gemara, I guess, in Erechin Daf Tezayin, but he's making a very serious mistake. Let me explain. In Erechin Tezayin, the Gemara notices a smichus. Zog the Gemara, there's a relationship here. A person has to give someone else musa, but don't embarrass him. If you embarrass him, you're left with the bill. That's why you have the very embarrassing a yid. So this shayel understood that if you give someone musa and doesn't hurt him, good. If you embarrass him, it's awesome. But that's wrong for two reasons. First of all, as the Poskim explain, no one enjoys hearing teichach. I mean, very few people are what the Mishnah says, oyef teichachis. People feel bad. The Gemara is not saying don't be mechiach if he feels bad, or else the mitzvah teichach is basically not negeya. Choose the least painful way. The Rashi says don't do it berabim, do it b'yechidus. The Rambam says even b'yechidus, don't embarrass him if you could do it in a nice way. So you have to find the most delicate, sensitive way of giving teichacha. But it's not a criterion, if he feels bad you can't do it. That's unthinkable. So if a person's sitting by a crowd talking lashonhora and he tries to make a very subtle reminder they don't listen, Avadi has to walk away. But there's another point. When there's an avera in progress, it's not an issue of hoicheach teichiach. That's not frisha me'isurai. That the Gemara says, ein chachma min eitzah keneged Hashem. And I found the Areim in Simreish Chav Gimel, it's one of the Bali Atayser of Lezami Mitz. He says, hoicheach teichiach, that's going, the Gemara's case of doing it gently is going on teichacha. But la frisha me'avera, you have to do what you can in anything to stop an avera that's in progress. Which is very similar to Rav Nissan's Yisayt, the chiluk between teichacha about a past deed, or an ongoing Aveira that we have to stop the Aveira. So maybe we could apply that with a parent. A person could walk away from the table, again in a nice way, you want to get a safe, excuse me, I want to get a safer. Again, if it's done gently, it might be perceived as respectful. But what to me was interesting, should a son have to close his ears? Should him sitting by the Shabbos table, there are a lot of guests, and the father's saying what happened in shul, and the son starts to close his ears. So Rav Nissen Karelitz himself in his Sefer, this Takadih Hilchos Kibbutz of Amarei Sadik Daled, he says, no, closing your ears in the presence of your parents is a bizayon to the parents. So I don't know if that's contradictory to what he said earlier, maybe that's already going after the fact, but in Hilchos lashonhora, Rav Nissen Sefer, in the end of Perek Daled, he's a little more open that maybe if there's no other eitzah, that would be the eitzah, to close your ears. But he says one thing is certain, the child has to be very strong, not to be makabel to lashonhora, not to believe it. So I'm not sure exactly how to reconcile what Rav Nissen says, the bezoyin is mutter, but here he says it's awesome. But one thing I think is very clear, that the child is in a very difficult situation. The parent should not subject the child to that situation. But one thing is certain, not to believe it. You have to realize that parents are talking out of anger, so a person doesn't see the true story. But one thing the parents have to hear, that by talking lashonhora, they're pouring hot lead down that child's throat, something that's really unforgivable. The child has to go b'darchei noyam, but the parents have to be above that nisayon and realize that they have to give a child a positive chinuch, a lasting chinuch, and not chas v'shalom the fakerta. If the parent tells the child, gives him out, tell me what happened, I want to hear what happened. So that the Chafetz Chaim writes twice in lashonhora aleph hey and Mechilus aleph hey. Even if the parents insist hifziruhu, he's not allowed to say lashonhora. Now that of course is more pashut, because that the parent wants the child to do an aveira. Imagine the parent says, open your mouth, I want to stuff down some tarfas down your throat. No child would say, okay, go ahead, what could I do? He has to do whatever possible not to be over. Now, what should the child do? Again with seichel, I hope the Rosh Hashanah gives him the seichel. I once saw in the Ma'aseh Ish, Chelik Dal Kuf Tzadikei, a chashuv person, it says, came to the Chazon Ish, he was talking politics, that was lashonhora. The Chafetz Chaim, the Chazon Ish picked up his hand and says, I would love to hear what you have to say, but that Alter von Raden lot mir nicht. The old Yidden Rad doesn't let me hear this. I told someone once, if you're in such a situation, think what the Chafetz Chaim would do if his father wanted to tell him lashonhora, if there was such a metzias. But if you go with darchei noyam, abolatayim, messiah noisai, but again, try to convey the message, I would love to tell you lashonhora, but I'm not allowed to, and you know it and I know it, that ani Hashem. But certainly there's no heta when the child is being told to say lashonhora. To him to do an aveira, an active aveira, is definitely us. And I want to make a point. Rav Nissen in that sefer says, listening to lashonhora is also an issur. It's not just a sheval tas, it's a ma'aser shmiya. But then he could say, I'm not makabel, so it won't be an issur. I had recently a painful shayla where a son asked me that the parents he felt were doing something wrong. He wanted to talk to his sibling lashonhora about the parents, l'te'eles for the parents. So that's frightening. I mean, the lashonhora in itself is frightening, but this is mamish ora makla of ve'imai. But the emes is, if the son is 100% certain that it is a te'eles for the parents, the mashal, it was parents were having a shalom bayis issue or divorced, whatever it may be, but something like that, that the son is certain that he's talking the te'eles. So that, the emes, I saw the Sefer Chassidim, one of the Rishonim, in Siman Tov, Sof Reish Pei Zayin. He says an interesting thing, if a son sees that someone's giving his parent an aveda to hold, an item to hold, and the parents are not trustworthy, he should tell the mafkid, don't give it to my parents, they're not trustworthy. That's lashonhora l'te'eles, and the Sefer Chassidim seems to justify that. Rav Zilberstein, Aleinu Shabeach Chelik Dal Tov Reish Pei Hey, he says Rabbi Yasha was masking to this. If a daughter works in a nurse where a father's a hospital, in the same hospital, the father's a doctor, and the father obviously has some type of problems, and he takes things home from the hospital without asking permission, he's stealing. So the daughter has an obligation to speak up and inform the authority that her father's taking, if she can't tell him straight, because he's been going on Geneva. That's a form of lashonhora te'eles, even on a father. I mean, we wouldn't call that mesira, perhaps, but that's te'eles, that's the genuine good for the parent. He shouldn't be oiv on geneva. So if the son is certain, 100%, that this is te'eles, there would be a special heta of lashonhora te'eles, even regarding parents. We have this question often. The mother says, do something. Then the father comes home, who told you to do this? The child says, Mommy told me to do it. Obviously, that's a lack of kibbutz. And Taka the Beis Lechem Yehuda on the page in Yeridei Reish Mem Yud Zayin says, don't do that, because you're causing the father to be angry at the mother. That's a violation of kibbutz. I heard from Rabbi and it's printed in the Atar Lamelech and Amba Tzadik Hey. Besides the issur of kibbutz, it's also an issur of lashonhora. The Chavetz Chaim in the end of Klal Yud discusses the same question regarding even not a parent. You can't say someone else did it, will make it machlokes between the other person and the one that told you to do it. That's rechilas. So Rapam said, obviously, it's two avlas. L'avla b'shnayim. Telling the father, Mommy told me to do it, is besides a violation of kibbutz, is also an issur of lashonhora. A very, very important question to mention, it's also comes up in different forms, is the questions of Shmiras Haloshon between bein ish le'ishtay in shalom bayis. So one thing is klar, the Chavetz Chaim writes in Klal Ches Sif Yud, there's no chilik regarding husband and wife, and other people, lashonhora is issur, and there's no special heta. Someone asked me, yeah, but I want to share my life with my wife. I says, fine, share your life, don't share your gehenim. Because there's no heta. Now, he says, yeah, but ishtay kegufay. I says, wonderful. That's the way you live your life. Ishtay kegufay means mechabda yoysim megufay, and treat her better than yourself, but don't be mechabara with issurim chamurim. So that's certainly pashit. Rav Sternbuch in Chelik Dalet Shin Yud Beis, and I saw the whole story was, his father, Rav Sternbuch's father, wrote a letter to the Heilige Chavetz Chaim, and he says, there's small talk at home. We talk about things that everybody knows about. It might be lashonhora, but it's meforce medua lakol. Is that mutter? And the Chavetz Chaim made a point of responding, and he has the letter, and he said, there's no difference. Even if it's your dua, a home should be free of lashonhora, even bein ish le'ishtay. More pashit, and this is obviously, unfortunately, this needs to be mentioned, there's no heta to talk about a spouse. A person has a problem, a grievance about his wife, so what does he do? He talks to his friend. That's the worst detriment in shalom bayis. He's talking about his wife to a friend, and the wife's not presenting her side of the story, and the friend will just incite him, oh, your wife's no good. I mean, ein lecha lashonhora and chilul shalom bayis more than talking about a spouse behind their backs. And the Chavetz Chaim writes of it of a pashit, but it's worse. People don't realize, they want to just vent their frustrations, but the other person, your friend, is not sympathetic to your wife's needs, doesn't know the story, is just going to make it aggravate the problem. So that's a churban, definitely doesn't need much mention. What we do have to speak about is sometimes a person comes home after a hard day at work and his wife looks like she's about to explode. Something happened today in either her day, in her workplace, and if he's going to ask her, you don't look good, he's going to get an earful of grievances about something that happened at work. In other words, she has to unburden, there's many English words for it, obviously there's a need for it, unburden, let off steam, or, basically vent. She has a problem, and she wants her husband to be sympathetic and empathize with her. So obviously, if the husband knows he could solve the problem, he could somehow give her eitzah, if there's some foreseeable tayeles, or even a suffix tayeles, so lashonhora tayeles is mutter. I'm talking about a situation that he knows the problem, it's an ongoing chronic problem, and it's not going to help. It's going to be temporary relief, she lets it off. There's a certain type of therapy of listening to someone vent. Now, the point is, it's his wife. Someone told me once, what is the definition of a nudnik? He says, you know what it is? When you ask someone how you're doing, and he tells you how he's doing. He starts telling you, what's bothering him. That's, of course, not a Yiddish definition. But with the wife, a person has to ask how you're doing and has to hear the answer. But the problem is, if it's basically lashonhora and there's no foreseeable te'eles, is there any heta because she looks very distraught? So the Chavetz Chaim, not regarding a wife per se, but in Klal Yud, see if you're down on the Agah, he says maybe efsha, if listening to the lashonhora is just let the person let off steam, it might be mutter, it might be a te'eles based on the Gemara in Yuma Daf Ayin Hey, with the Gemara darshans the pasuk, and the Gemara says doga belev ish yasichenu lacherim. It's a pasuk in Mishlei which the Gemara reads it yasichenu lacherim. So the Chavetz Chaim understood that we see that talking over a problem is a benefit. So that would be considered a benefit regarding Shmiras Haloshon, and it's considered lashonhora te'eles. And yes, you're allowed to ask lav dafka wife. Another person, not do a penechem rayim yayim, and you'll hear an earful, but it's te'eles. Now the obvious kasha on this raya is you look at the Gemara, is not talking about lashonhora. In fact, Rashi says doga means he's worried about something, a hefsid. He's worrying about his business or his health or the stock market. And Rashi tells yasichenu lacherim shema yasiuhu eitza. In other words, he might be able to help you. And the Aruch says you might daven for him, but it's absolutely not a raya that you're allowed to talk lashonhora. It's not even talking about a lashonhora situation. It's a person has a problem about their health, and they want to talk about it, and you might be able to help them. But the Gemara is not permitting lashonhora. And I guarantee you the Chavetz Chaim, Nupshat in the Gemara, I guarantee that's why the Chavetz Chaim wrote Efsha. He's not saying from the Gemara is a raya to our case, perfect raya. He's just illustrating that when a person talks out something, there's a temporary relief of his problem. And that's why the Paiskim say, although the Chavetz Chaim wrote Efsha, his Talmud said this, he wrote Efsha because it could be abused. Some people use this heta indiscriminately, and it's takanat mutter. In fact, Rabbi Yakov Kamenetsky in the Emes Yakov and Archaim Siman Kuf Nun Vav point out something that's very penetrating. He says, there's no heta venting, letting off steam. That's an issur of avodah zarah. Avodah zarah? Because yeah, the Gemara says in Masechta Shabbos, HaMeshabeh Kelev B'chamasai, he just lets out his frustration and a futile attempt just to burst out of anger. That's Kelev avodah zarah. So there's no heta of venting. The Chavetz Chaim is talking about someone is upset that there's a rush of a toivloi, and he doesn't understand how it Rasham lets this. But stam venting, just like instead of breaking a window, you let out lashonhora. Yankov, that's wrong. Lemaisa, the Paiskim are mekel. Interestingly enough, the Sefer Chassidim in Siman Samach Dal, it seems to be mekel about this very shaila. But what I want to mention, in the Gefer our sugya, Rav Hamza Khan al-Baruch, when I asked him, what should I say b'Rabbim? I had the shaila many years ago. So he told me a merdika diyuk. The Sefer Chinuch in Mitzvah Samachei explains the issur chomer of almana v'yosem lo yisanum. Why is there a special severity to hurting an almana v'yosem? So the Chinuch writes, Ben koivel la'aviv, isha l'bayla, but almana v'yosem have no one to turn to. So the Chinuch is not talking about lashonhora. But look at the way the Chinuch described typical daily living. It's natural that a son cries out to a parent, a wife, isha koivelas l'bayla. That means the Chinuch recognized that as a normal reaction. A wife has a problem, she cries out to her husband. So he said there's probably more of a heta between ish le'ishtay and between parent and child. A parent has to give that open line of communication to a child, and a husband has to have that for the wife also. I saw Reb Chaim Kanievsky in one of his tshuvas, they asked him, but how does the heta work of koivelas? You're supposed to work on yourself. So Reb Chaim obviously understands the human emotion. He says, but eina yachol, he can't. He tried. What should he do? Explode? He can't. If you could, you could have. We're talking about somebody can't. Then they asked him, is there a chiyuv to listen to your wife or a shibud? So his response is one word, mitzvah. So there you have a das Torah, avada if they could control it, that's the best course of action. But if eina yachol, then it becomes a mitzvah. Now, the husband that's listening should use seichel. hear what she says, express her empathy, but try to put a te'ela spin. Try to explain why, the other person maybe didn't mean so what they did. Pam gave me an example of his mother. He said his mother was the rebbetzin of the city, and someone once came, a younger man, he was very upset about his share. Why? Because he promised me naden, and now he's not giving. He can't afford it, but he promised, how can he not keep his word? So Pam's mother says, fakert. If he didn't promise you, that means he didn't hold of you. Then you should be angry. But he promised you, he holds of you. But never he can't do it. You should feel very good. And suddenly he started to smile again. Oh, that's pretty good way of looking at things. So step one is when you listen to the grievances, try to work with it. And number two, like the Aruch says, when you hear a problem, daven the wife should be able to manage. Very often when a wife has a grievance, just say, tell me what happened with all the details, just leave out the name. I don't have to know who it is. I'm very upset at the person. I'm going to be angry. Tell me what bothers you and leave out the name. Usually that works just as good as if you mention the name. If it's a chronic problem, it would be much better to try to help the wife learn to deal with the problem and the person than every day go chayze chalila. In other words, let's try to work. This is not going to change. Here's a problem with a daughter-in-law or a mother-in-law, whatever it is. It's not going to change. Let's get used to the person and the problem, and then we could live without all these difficulties. Now, of course, this heter is not a steer to what the Chafetz Chaim says there's no special heter husband or wife, because there is no special heter. But when a wife is overburdened with a problem, that's the husband's obligation to try to clear the air. Now, someone asked, but is it mutter for the husband when he's upset to vent to his wife? So probably in Svara it's mutter, but I want to tell you what the Chafetz Chaim says. He says sometimes people tell their wives who insult them in shul, who insult them at work, and he quotes none other than the Avos Daf Nosson in the end of Perik Zayin, and he quotes the exact lashon. I thought maybe he was just embellishing it, but the Avos Daf Nosson says, don't tell your wife who upset you and who didn't give you respect, because then you're convincing her that she married the world's biggest loser. And then she thinks, in shul, they're not mechaberim. At home, I don't see any reason mechaberim. So you're just ruining your own name in her eyes. So basically, he says, it might be mutter, but it's not productive. It's usually counterproductive. So, in other words, approach with caution with that part of the heter. But certainly with a husband and a wife, the husband has to be there to hear his wife's grievances. Now, the same chaymer of lashonhora applies to all relatives. Some people think my brother is mutter, my uncle is mutter. We know differently. We know the two main stories of lashonhora in the Torah is Yosef and the brothers, and Miriam. And like the Rambam says, she spoke about her brother Hakadosh, and she did it l'toivosai, and she did it l'shem shamayim, and he was a makbid v'ishmai sha'anav. And as the Chafetz Chaim quotes the lashon, kal v'choyma l'shar b'nei adam hatipshim hamar m'ladab gedolos v'neflois al chavreim shebevada yenshu al zeh ma'oid. Ma'adach Miriam is the prototype, is the example of lashonhora l'shem shamayim, and did it for his toiva. So there's no special heter in any relationship other than, as we said, specific cases. A very important part of the family life in Shmiras Haloshon is in parents with children. So one thing is clear, and the Chafetz Chaim points this out, that basically there's no free pass to talk about children. Chafetz Chaim gives an interesting mashal in Klal Daled Yud Aleph on the second Haggah. A child is mashal, he's married, living out of town, and the father says, "Hey, how's my bicycle doing?" And the person starts telling him that his son's not doing that well. So if there's no way this father could do something with that information, if there's no foreseeable, possible tayeles, that's lashonhora. I is my son, but there's no special easy pass son, father. It's tayeles. Okay, the truth is today, we live in a very small world. There's always ways of helping a child that's struggling. But at least in theory, we should know that the heter of talking about children is only l'tayeles, no different than anybody else. Rav Ozna in Chelik Yud Kuf Samach Beis was asked from a Rebbe that when they have PTA and a parent comes to see the Rebbe, or the Rebbe or more, whatever it may be, knows something about the child, should they tell the parent about the child, because really it's a problem in the yeshiva, in the school. So he said, Rav Ozer says, b'derech klal, parents have to be on the same page with the Rabbi, and they have to know what's going on. If you're certain that the parents will not be able to do anything with the problem, then you shouldn't say. But b'derech klal, there has to be an open line of communication between parents and mechanchim. Basically, there's always a chance of at least a potential toyeles. One point I will mention, parents discussing married children is not advisable, not healthy, and not good for the relationship. And sometimes there's no toyeles involved. Because then when parents get involved with married children's lives, they end up having a wife that has to unburden about the daughter-in-law who's this and this and this and that. So it's really a sort of a vicious cycle. It's basically when something could be done or should be done, you could do it. It's best to basically follow what Chazal have told us, that we have to do what's our business and not mingle in other people's business, unless of course that's really the Tzav Hashah. A very important question is, someone told me he heard that it's mutter to say lashonhora on a cotton. Now that's not right. The Chavetz Chaim in Ches Gimel seems to imply that on a cotton maybe it's mutter because there's no damage to the cotton. But the Chavetz Chaim himself in Hilchos Rechilah Zayin Aleph says there's no difference speaking about a cotton or a gadol. And basically Rabbi Yashiv said it very bluntly when he said, of course there's an issur talking about a cotton. He's a yid, he's not a shaita, he's a bardas, and we know cotton yesh leiboishis. So the Chavetz Chaim's implication is that if there's no damage to the cotton, maybe it's mutter, but he meant only certainly when it's not a bezoyan to the child. So there's no special heter talking about a child. I once had this child, one grandparent had didn't get along with a certain anicle. And they were talking to their spouse, the other grandparent, about the anicle. That's only not a kin, it's only a child. First of all, that's a diba hamazik. You're ruining the relationship between a grandparent and a child. If you don't like the child, so stay away. But more than that, it's a lashonhora. And what's taka wrong, and I'd like to mention it because here what comes up, some people think it's a mitzvah by the Sheva brachas of the chassan to say what he did when he was a child. So besides lashonhora, it's not good for shalom bayis. She doesn't have to know who she married, and he's embarrassed, and everybody's laughing, of course. But that's not what Chazal meant. Igur de behilula mili. That's not nice Sheva brachas talk. Even about mitzvah talking about what the child did when he was young. The only heter talking about a child is if the child did something childish that's appropriate for that child's age. So then it's not lashonhora. It's understandable, but basically cotton, kigadol, there is no special heter regarding a cotton. Another sticky issue is when a parent sees that the child is associating with a bad influence, a friend that's not a good influence, sometimes laida, it could be a sibling that's a bad influence. So this is a real sakana. Gashmi, ruchni, emotionally, all of the above. And definitely this is a situation of extreme toyeles. And here we see something unprecedented. The Chavetz Chaim and lashonhora in Daled Ber Chaim Sif Cotton Mem Gimel, he says that if you see such a relationship forming, a child's associating with a bad friend, not only you have to do something, efshel lemutta legadel, which is incorrectly tight, you're not even lie and speak bad about the bad person, even exaggerate. Now the Chavetz Chaim did not sanction lying. Legadel does not mean lying or adding any facts that are not true. He meant legadol means you have to accentuate the problem and illustrate the problem and make it very graphic that it's a real problem. But whatever the case, the Chavetz Chaim is going to an extreme to do something with exaggeration to stop this relationship. Why? Why not? This is a real roidif. This is a real problem of a toyeles. And the Chavetz Chaim but cautions in Daled Yud. He says, but make sure that you first tell your child, whether it's a child or a talmid, that usually this is terrible lashonhora, but this is toyeles. I am fulfilling the mitzvah of leisamid al dam riyecha. Now, with a boy that's mature, you could give him this mashal. Marrying an eishes achiv is a terrible issur, even after misa's achiv. But then there's a mitzvah of yibum. The Baruch's ratzon is Eishdach v'zasik et matzah yibum. Lashonhora is a terrible avera, but when it's a samar adam riyach, it's a mitzvah. A younger child doesn't understand. You have to do it with seichel. But again, to keep the sensitivity, the zero tolerance, and this is not a deviation from that sensitivity. What's very sensitive is to tell a child, stay away from your own sibling. So obviously, if it ever gets back to the other son, that my father said that my brother can hang around with me, that's a death sentence to the child's future. That's like chutz me'acher, Rachmana litzlan. So then the father has to know how to do it, and he has to make sure that it will never get back to the child that has a bad influence. And if it's not sure that could happen, maybe sheval tasad. But certainly, a very serious problem is it shouldn't get back to the one you said that about, because that could destroy the person instantly. A child comes home from yeshiva, and he's not just talking lashonhora, he's blasting. Rabbi did this, and he's all upset. So this is a perfect opportunity. Now let me explain. Because mitzad echad, the child's talking lashonhora, v'chein lo yayasa, not an hour home. But mitzad sheni, this could be the heta of lahafik dagay, lahafik tzaray, ben kaiva la'aviv. But like every nisayan is always an opportunity. Here, a parent has to use seichel and say, listen, that's not the way you talk in this house. You don't talk about your Rebbe like that. We have to stop and start again. The nusach is unacceptable. You have a problem, I'm there for you, I love you, I want to help you, but you can't talk that way. Some things are, you don't cross that line. Calm down and we'll talk. Tell me what happened. Then the parent should listen with sympathy and act accordingly. If the child has any truth, then don't say the Rebbe is wrong, of course. Say, let me look into it. And act appropriately. If the child is wrong, say, listen, when you have a problem, come to me. That's what I'm here for. But this time, I don't think you're right, and try to explain to him. Ach vei on a child that can't cry at his heart to a parent. He'll find someone else that will aggravate the problem much worse. So this is ben kaiva la'aviv. Rab Nissen in the Sefer lashonhora Amachin Amagimel stresses this point. You have to play both sides of the fence. Mitzad echad, you can't encourage him to talk lashonhora, but he has to find a sympathetic ear in a parent. So, but again, it's a perfect opportunity of chinuch. No child is born perfect, but parents have to make their children perfect. And this is a perfect opportunity of that. Mein Kind, I care what you have to say, but you have to talk differently. We have to start again, talk respectfully, and we could talk. Then you send the zero tolerance attitude, you send the concern that you have, but there always has to be an open line of communication. Many children are lost because their parents didn't show that interest, and they found other ears that were much more damaging to them, and that's the beginning of the end, Rachmana litzlan. I once heard a chiddush, and I say so with the italics in it, that there's a special heta to talk, give lashonhora, or to talk lashonhora about a relative, based on the pasuk מבשרך al תתעלם. Actually, the pasuk is מבשרך lo תתעלם, but the belt says al תתעלם. Now this can be because the Chavetz Chaim says beferish in Klal Yud, the end of Siv Dalid, Nechshalon Kama Nashim, there's no such heta. But I looked into the sugya, and there is a little bit truth which is part of our share today. In Ksubis Nun Beis and in Peivav again, two different stories about two different Amirayim. One's about Rabbi Yochanan and one's about Rabbi Nachman, that they advise their relative in a certain situation what to do. So they asked him, how are you giving advice to a relative? How are you not supposed to do that? Because you're favoring your relative over the other person. It was a question of a sichsuch. So they said, מבשרך lo תתעלם. So obviously there's a little truth to that. But if you look at the Gemara, it's pashut kipshuta. There's no heta to talk lashonhora, either to a relative or about a relative, whatever it may be. The only heta on מבשרך lo תתעלם is when you're in a situation of my chazis. Why is this one better than that one? My own mahai mihai. And I'll give you a perfect mashal. Someone calls you a close relative, he needs information about your neighbor. In other words, you know, and I trust you're going to tell me everything about the neighbor that I have to know. There are some things that in halacha, we call that subjective chesroinis. You're not mechuyev to say everything. You're not mechuyev to say everything about your neighbor. But Lamaisa, if you're asked, you're allowed to say. If your relative calls you and says, tell me, I have to know about your neighbor, your friend, whatever it is, because I'm very involved with the shidduch. The understanding is, I trust you. Chazu da'alecha kosamichna. I'm relying on you. So here, you're not saying lashonhora, you're saying the truth. And it's negay for the shidduch. But in a regular case, we say, my chazi, the him over him. Why should I say information to this one, I'm going to hurt the other one, even though it's true? So when it's a my chazi situation, that I saw, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman in the Shalmei Simcha, Sefer especially about Simcha, that has a shtickle about lashonhora and Shidduchim. Rav Sternbuch in Chelik Dalet Siman Shin Yud Beis says, if it's only a question of my chazis, then we could say, Mibsarcha Leit Tesalem tilts the balance. Because now you know why my chazis. This is the regular person, and this is my relative. So that's why only in the case of my chazis is there a heta to give a little more information. Now, I mentioned the case of a neighbor. I really should have been more careful. Because if you look at the Gemara, Yevamos, the end of Samach Beis, Amar Beis, Amavol Dik Gemara. The Gemara says, Ha'oyev Eshcheinav, Ha'makarbes Kroivav, Alava Kasavayma. And the Gemara quotes the Pasuk, Os Turkav Hashem Yana. And Rashi says, it's going on Le'elmine, Mipsarcha Leit Tisalem, Hainu Oyev Eshcheinav, Shehem Kekroivav. So the Stipler had a minig that when he was invited to a simcha of a neighbor, he would literally be Ma'aseh Nefesh to go. He didn't have the kaiches, but the Gemara says, the Rashi learns, Mipsarcha Leit Tisalem goes on a shachan. So for a relative that Ma'aseh Nefesh zayin, for a shachan also. So Paiskim say that, Chaim Kanievsky said this based on the Rashi, that by a shachan is also a little more obligations. So you have to really understand when there's a question of lashonhora, there's no heta telling a relative something that's lashonhora. It's only when it's a ma'chazis, you're asking information from your relative about someone else, and they're relying implicitly on your information that is total. Then there might be a specific heta of sharing what's true, what's ta'eles, even if otherwise you wouldn't have to volunteer it. We had this question, a true story. Someone asked, a person that asked me, about your brother. His brother's a caterer. They want to know two questions. Is he reliable and punctual? Now the relative knew that the brother's a good caterer, but he is very unreliable and very unpunctual. That's his weaknesses. And they asked point blank. I guess they heard about it. So to say, Mipsarcha Leit Tisalem, and I'm going to say, yes, he's very punctual and he's very reliable, is sheker and lifnei iva. There's no heta for that. What you could do is, you have to realize that if you're going to say the truth, it's going to get back to your brother what you said. The Chavetz Chaim does say in Rechilas Klal Tes, Sif Kat Meim Ber Maim Chaim, if you give valid information that was mutter, but it's going to cause a machlokes, it's going to get back to the other person, they're going to be upset, then you can't give the information. So what you could say basically, if I told this person, listen, it's not fair to ask me. If I tell you good, you don't believe me, I'm a karev. I won't tell you bad about my brother anyhow, so you're not getting anywhere, so I am not in this equation. Basically, use chachma to dray out of it, but there's no heta to say the truth, to lie, that's for sure. To say the truth might be mutter, but it's again very, very dangerous. It's certainly going to get back, and it's going to lead to machlokes in a family that's very no good. Ma'aseh shehaya, true story, someone asked me this, the married daughter confided in her mother and says, don't tell Tati about this problem, I'm telling you but tonight. The mother wasn't able to deal with the problem and she needed her husband's help, but she gave a word. So Rabbi said, we know Yiddishkeit, what Gilui said, what we revealed in confidential information is, the question is there a het of Gilui said b'makom tayeles? This is a qualified tayeles, no doubt. Is there a het of Gilui said b'makom of tayeles? So the emphasis, Yuma Daf Daled, we learn the original source of Gilui Soid. I always say, if you want to ask your children a riddle, what is the most often repeated lav in the Torah? Gilui Soid. Gemara learns in the Pasuk Leimar, Azoit Suzagin, that if they don't say Leimar, you're not allowed to say it over. So how many times does it say Leimar in the Torah? So it's the most often repeated lav. But there's a second source of Gilui Soid, that's Sanhedrin Laf Lamed Aleph, that when Dayanim are leaving Bezdin, so one Dayan can say, I voted in your favor, but I was outvoted. Shenema, Talmud Loimer, Leiselech Rachel Bamecha, V'oimer, a pasuk in Mishlei, Hoylech Rachel Megala Soid. The Gemara combines Gilui Soid and the issur is of lashonhora. More so, the going on that pasuk in Mishlei, and I quote l'shayin kachay, "Kloima hamagala soid hu daimel haylach rachel v'avaynam shava." So the Goyin is saying that the issur of Gilui Soid is a subset, a form of lashonhora. And the Chavetz Chaim in Mechilus, the end of Klal Ches, quotes the Shari Tshuva Rabbeinu Yoina Gimel Reish Chaf Hei, that he says even if there's no actual Mechilus involved, but it's definitely very damaging to tell secrets. Now we spoke about this. We once gave a whole shir about Gilui Soid. But one thing I'm very comfortable of saying, I saw Rav Nissen in his Chutshani in lashonhora, the end of Perik Hey, he says that basically there's no heta of Gilui Soid even to one's wife. His mashal is, if you take a job and they tell you certain trade secrets, don't tell anybody, that includes your wife. There's no special heta. The ishtika gufa again means treat her nicely, not Gilui Soid. Now, I always wondered, you're told, your wife is told by someone's getting engaged tonight, don't tell anybody. Does that include your husband? So that you have to know what people have in mind when they say don't tell anybody. Maybe the husband's a nobody, so it's mutter. But basically you have to know in what wording it is. But one thing is pashut, and I saw Kamat, all Paiskim say this. If it's a question of lashonhora, of Gilui Soid l'tayeles, then it can't be that Gilui Soid is worse than lashonhora if it's avaynam shava. And just like we said that there's a het of lashonhora l'tayeles, in this case where the mother cannot deal with the problem without the father's help, that would be a qualified Gilui Soid l'tayeles. I saw the Chalkas Yaakov and Even Ezra Simon Ayin Tes in a terribly tragic shaila. I don't know how it even happened, but a bacha had a terminal illness. His days were limited, not years, days, months were limited. But he was unaware of the condition. And he got engaged. The doctor wanted to know, should he tell the other side that he's not going to have a first anniversary? So he said, Avadi, he has to. There's no issur Gilui Soid, b'makam pikuach nefesh. I wondered, Lamaisa, a doctor has a physician's oath, he's not supposed to breach confidentiality. He doesn't speak about it, but in the Tzitzel he has a Tezayin Dalid, he does speak about it. And he said, a different shaila, a girl had an operation as a child, she can't have children, so the doctor has to go without being asked and tell the other party. And he says, the physician's oath, but he's mushba v'aymed miharsina leisamer adam riyecha. It's basically, there's no such shvua, it's not chal, he didn't mean that. But one thing I will tell you, that in a case where there's a real need, there's no issur Gilui Soid, that we see, and that's klar. What was very moving is Rav Zilberstein, Zayin Gesund, has a shaila in the Sefer, a few places where the one I mentioned earlier, a woman was sick, she told her husband, don't tell my father b'shem oifen, I don't want to know. But the husband feels the father's tefillah could do wonders. So Rav Zilberstein Kedarkei, in this Vaharevna on Chelik Gimel, page 149, he mentions a few sources that we find that a parent's tefillah has more koyach than the average. The supporter in Bereishis Lamed Beis Aleph says that Lavan woke up in the morning and the pasuk makes a point of saying that he benched his children. Why? Because a parent's tefillah, a parent's bracha has more koyach than the average. That's why Yitzchak gave a bracha to Esau before he died, and he points to Parshas Yisrael, the Torah Aruch says, means that the Bainishtam and your parents will give you arichas yamim. How could your parents give arichas yamim? Because parents davening for children is a special skula for the children. So he says in that case, the parent, the husband should tell the father, even though he promised his wife not to, of course, shouldn't get back to his wife, unless, of course, the father will take it in a bad way. And perhaps Achron Chaviv, just make a point, I think is the Sikum of today, and that is basically the most important part of this sugya of Shmiras Haloshon and family life is that the success of Shmiras Haloshon begins in family life. The Chavetz Chaim in two places, Mishtabura in Shin Mem Gimel, Sifkat and Beis, and the end of Klal Tes, wonders how come there's such a pirza of lashonhora. I once said this, and I wasn't being sarcastic, and I mean it from the bottom of my heart. If we would treat lashonhora the way we treat gebrocks, Mashiach would be here. Even those that don't keep gebrocks know the severity of it, right? If we would treat lashonhora like gebrocks, Mashiach would be here. So why don't we treat lashon hara like a bracha? Does anybody question that it's much, much, much more chamor? And the Chofetz Chaim is pained by that question without the mashal of it, but he says, why don't we see as a hiris? Imagine a son comes to a Shabbos table, says, I'm 20 years old, I've been washing the Tilas Yadayim for the past 17 years, tonight I'm taking vacation, no washing, and he bites into the bread without a Tilas Yadayim. Which parent would you say, oh, what else is new? No one would just let it go. But lashon hara, what happens? Well, a little louder, I don't hear you. So the Chofetz Chaim, the problem is not enough of a chinuch. Therefore, the solution starts in the home. When a home is a fortress of Shmiras Haloshon, when parents are living Shmiras Haloshon, when there's zero tolerance for lashon hara, then the children grow up that it's at least as bad as gebrachts. And the Ramban says that's in the Parshas Kiseitze, that's the chiyuv of Maisa Miriam. We're talking lashon hara about Miriam. Why? It's to show the severity and give over to the children, but if we tell our children that, then the children will have a chinuch. The best chinuch is not do as I say, but do as I do. Rabbi Nissen Karelitz, in the Sefer, he says his mother told of a story that happened probably 80 years earlier. She was a little child walking in the street, and someone said something bad about her father. And she ran home as a protective child, says, you know what someone said about you? And the father jumped and says, Oi, rechilus. And it went into her bones, and she couldn't say lashon hara afterwards. And I could just say, as my Shrer Zechron Levracha told me, heard from his mashgiach Yisrael Chaim Kaplan, who was once by the Chofetz Chaim, and the story happened, my chedman is over 100 years before my Shver heard the story. I mean, as far as when I'm saying over the story, at least 100 years earlier. And he started saying, Shver Chaim started saying something to the Chofetz Chaim, and the Chofetz Chaim thought for a second that maybe it was lashon hara. And he jumped back and said, Oi, lashon hara. So Chaim said, as if I brought a dead mouse in his presence. So Chaim said it with tremendous emotion, and my Shver told this to me, and I'm telling it to you. So over 100 years earlier, a story of a little of an emotion, of a passion, of a commitment, and look how much it does. That's the way to change the trend, and hopefully we can make a world free of lashon hara. Halavai, we should see it be Ameinu, Amen v'Amen. Okay.
B'Shem English, I would like to thank Rabbi Smith for the wonderful share. Next Sunday will be the last year before the summer, Mi'etz Hashem. In 2 weeks is starting the summer shirm in all the neighborhoods. Borough Park, Williamsburg, and Flatbush, Monday, Pashas Pinchas. Rabbi say, all the neighborhoods, everybody's joining in the big campaign of Shalshelas. I'm sure you heard about Shalshelas. Shalshelas is a school of Pekuach Nefesh. Hundreds of our girls, of our neighbors that can't make it in schools and never drop out of the houses. And Rahman al-Islam are could be the biggest tragedy. Come Shalshelas, where Rav Tzadik, Reb Chaim Kogelman, the Nasi of Shalshelas, who is here with us, the schus to get a bracha from him, who Rav Pam was the miyasad of this moisid. This is the only pekuach nefesh moisid we have in our neighborhood. Someone that has a girl Nebuch, that we want to have heilige generations from them. They send to Shalshelas, they become the father, they become the mother, they take care of them, and who pays for it? Rabbi said we have to pay for it. We want to have a schus of gute kinder, gute einiglach. We can't do anything more. This is one of the best mitzvahs and Torah and chinuch that you could do for the biggest chus for yourself. They make a campaign to cover over $500,000 of chayvus of the past year. The teachers were not paid. The kids can't open the school. They have to pay them. And the tzaddikim with their matching funds, we're asking everybody here to give $100, $180. And if you give $1,000, please do that too. It's a big, big mitzvah. We have Rabbi Kugelman in the back of his medish, the big tzaddik Arnov, who saved thousands of our children to become back to Yiddishkeit. And he has thousands of stories and success stories. Marries them off. Boys, heilig Yiddische Kinder. And if you want to have a schus for gute Kinder, this is the best investment. Please go over, give him $1,000. Tizker mitzvahs. I'm coming to Kashem, but Gushbach is like 12 years, but I'm mitzvah, and I'm going to have my sitka, Yagdil Teure V'yade, Kaddish, Mincha.
Amen.